Brought to you by LaunchPod Media.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the LaunchPod channel. I'm John, and today we're going to be talking about careful analytics and useful tools that you can use to make your podcast more successful. So the number one thing I get asked when I'm going to podcast conventions or when I'm going to speaking events or even when people come into my studio, they ask me, John, how can I grow my podcast? I have a cool podcast, but I have 4 people listening. I have my mom, my grandma, my dad, and some guy in West Virginia who I've never met before in my life. And I say, okay, have you talked to your audience? And if you want to learn more about the first basic things you can do, check out this video right here. I've already talked about this once. Today we're going to talk about how to get even more downloads, but a little bit more technical. These are basically the cheat codes that you can have to make your podcast a lot more successful. I'm going to give you 3 major tips that are going to make your podcast really take off in the long term. The first thing that I think that you can do that will make your podcast super successful is make sure that you are a big fish in a little pond. That is, make sure that your category that you're ranking for is not a general category. Do not do that. If you are a business podcast and you're talking about how people can raise their, influence through a certain type of marketing that you're a specialty in, let's say guerrilla marketing, you don't want to be in business overall. You want to be in business subcategory marketing on Apple Podcasts. If you're telling your personal story about how you overcome racism, then you don't want to just be in society and culture. You want to be in society and culture subcategory personal journals, for example. You want to be, instead of competing with every single person in the category overall, make sure that your RSS feed is tagged for the subcategory as opposed to the major category. Think about it this way. If you go into business, and you're competing against every single business, then you're competing against a lot more podcasts. But if you can compete against just podcasts in a smaller category, you have a better chance of actually getting your podcast featured, okay? Number 2, if you're podcasting and you've submitted your own RSS feed to Apple, the question is, have you been asking Apple to feature your show? They actually have a little tiny box where you can go and ask Apple to please feature my show. Mind you, you have to have 2 weeks of your podcast done in advance and some artwork and some other little tiny things, but you can still ask Apple, hey Apple, I'm a small time creator and I'd love to get my show developed. Can you please feature it? And you can write them a quick little letter, not to an email, but to a direct person that's actually going to read this. So that's idea number 2. Make sure your podcast has a chance to get featured and that you're going after the people in that audience that want to do it. So you're making sure you put yourself in that correct category. The next one seems obvious, but it may not be something that you always think about when coming to your podcast. No, I'm not talking about names. I'm not talking about titles. I'm not talking about show notes or transcripts or improving your RSS feed in that way. I'm talking about making sure that your podcast is absolutely shareable. When you go and you get someone to interview on your show, or you go interview on somebody else's show, like most people do, they tend to miss a big chance to get their podcast out there. They think just because I interviewed Tony Robbins means my podcast is just going to blow up. That's not how it works, guys. Tony Robbins actually has to share it. He's got a Twitter, he's got a Facebook, he's got an Instagram, he's got MySpace, he's got, Bebo. He's got a tons of stuff in places he can share his individual podcasts. So make sure that you're providing with him a way to share that podcast more successfully. When you send your thank you email and you're reaching out to him and you're tagging your podcast, how to improve your show, the podcasting podcast with Tony Robbins, so he has all the words there that people will search for. You need to make sure you're asking him and sharing that content in a way that's going to make it so people in his audience can be transplanted into your audience. Now, I am not a big fan of interview podcasts, so I'm going to give you one more useful tip so that your podcast can really take off. And this one's going to be a little bit more technical, but I hope it will give you a little bit of an advantage when it comes to improving your podcast. And that is, go into your podcast app, whichever one you're using. I personally use Apple Podcasts because that's where 80% of podcast listenership is. Go into Apple Podcasts, search up the word that you would use to find your podcast. Then go into the podcasts all around your individual show. There should be about 10 showing. The first 4 are the most important. Go into those shows. Say your podcast is on birth and you're a birthing expert. You're a doula or a midwife. Go into there and then find all the different shows in that area using the keyword birth. And then go and reach out to that person and see if you can cross-pollinate, see if you can collab together. But then once you do that, and say even if they don't want to do anything, look at the major colors of the individual podcasts that are on there. Say there's a lot of blue podcasts or a lot of green podcasts. I recommend changing your image to something that's red or orange so that your podcast pops out more in contrast to the other shows that are around it. Make sure that if there's a whole bunch of black podcasts, you're the only white podcast. If you have a whole bunch of green podcasts, make sure you have an orange podcast. If you have a purple podcast, make sure that there's a yellow one as well. Now, this may not always work, but it gives you a good foundation to see who's around you, who you're competing against, and who you have the potential to work with so that you can pop out just a little bit more. Also, make sure on your podcast image, there's the name of your show. You may have the prettiest face in the world like me, but that doesn't mean no one's going to want to click on your podcast. Make sure it has the name of your show directly in the middle and easy to understand, visible, clear, and easy, super easy to read. Don't do none of this like Helvetica, Crisco Sans garbage stuff in super handwriting that your little 4-year-old sister did for you. Actually make it legible in the middle of the show so I can see what the podcast is. You can name it something entirely different, but have on the title in that little picture the actual words that I can read, because that's what I'm looking for. With that, guys, I'm going to sign off here today. Make sure if you find these things useful, you leave a comment. And if you think I'm, saying garbage or, telling you lies, comment down below too, because I want to know who you are so I can hunt you down. Catch you guys later.